And it's a pleasure. We have a wonderful guest tonight, so it's a real pleasure to introduce to you Anna Cummins. She is a co-founder of an organization called 5 Gyres, and you might remember that last week when Chris Jordan was speaking, he talked about how he learned about the Midway Islands, and it was through Anna and her organization. She is a graduate from Stanford University in history, and then did one of my favorite degrees, International Environmental Policy, at the Monterey Institute. A great next step for people in this room. She's worked in a variety of capacities, doing research, teaching, involved in campaigns, fundraising, and so on in sustainability and marine life. Worked for the Algalita Research Institute before she started 5 Gyres. Now, this is, I think, in the eyes of many people around the world, one of the most remarkable sort of unintended consequences of our consumption practices over the last 30, 40, 50 years. To discover what we have done unintentionally to the oceans, and what we continue to do, now unfortunately fully cognizant of what's happening, is quite remarkable. And it's a real rare treat to be able to learn from somebody who has traveled to these areas, looked into them, investigated them, conducted research on what's happening and what might be possible to do about it. So please join me in welcoming to UCI Anna Cummins.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Genius Technology team that saved my almost crashed PowerPoint. Very much appreciated. I really appreciate being here to talk with you tonight. As you heard, I'm the co-founder of an organization with my husband, and I'll get into that story, of the 5 Gyres Institute. I particularly like talking to this age because, although it was longer than I cared to admit, I do remember being in college. And as you heard, I was a history major. So I wasn't really thinking about sustainability as a life course. And I definitely didn't think that I would aspire to spend my life studying garbage. So in some ways, I envy you guys being where you are with the world ahead of you, and in some ways, I don't, because the world that we're all inheriting is more fraught with challenges than it was when I was sitting in the same seat that you are. So before I get into plastic garbage, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got into this issue. I've always been interested in the beach. I mean, who doesn't love to go to the beach? And growing up, my first connection to the environment was doing beach cleanups with a local group in Santa Monica called Heal the Bay. And I definitely always saw plastic trash on the beaches, but I never really made the connection to what happens way far out to sea where no one really sees it. And it wasn't until many years later in 2001 I heard a lecture about this place called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Quick show of hands, have you guys heard about this? The Texas-sized island? Of course, I'm in a sustainability course, so of course you've heard about this. But I was so stunned by this. I was in graduate school at the time studying environmental policy, and no one was talking about this issue in 2001. So in 2004, I then got involved in volunteering for an organization here in Long Beach called the Algalita Marine Research Foundation. I just started sending them emails and was so consumed, no pun intended, by this issue that eventually I got invited on a research trip to Guadalupe Island, where I saw devastating impacts of plastic upon Laysan albatross, which you learned about last week from Chris Jordan. Fast forward many years, I have now, in the last 3 years, sailed 35,000 miles across all 5 oceans with my husband and our organization, and doing original research, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, and seeing that in a very short period of time, we have covered the world's seascapes with this thin layer of plastic confetti. But it's a relatively new material. We've only really had plastics for the last 100 years. So these were all kind of pivotal discoveries for me. And then 9 months ago, I had an even more amazing encounter with an individual that has changed the future of my work forever. And when we talk about sustainability, yes, I couldn't help showing a picture of my little girl. She's now almost 9 months old. And we talk about sustainability being, leaving the world a better place for the next generation. And now I really get it on a level that I never did before, which is not to say that you can't comprehend sustainability without having a child, but just that for me it brings this work into focus in a new way. So let's talk trash. Trash had pretty noble, well, specifically plastic had actually pretty noble beginnings. Before plastic, we used all natural resources, natural materials for a lot of our goods. And some of these were not so nice materials. For example, using ivory, using elephant tusks to make billiard balls and piano keys and all kinds of things. Using natural bristles to make our toothbrushes and our combs. So when plastic was first invented, it actually had some kind of environmental ideas to it. Let's not continue using our precious natural resources for these goods. Then in World War II, we boomed our production of plastic so that post-war, we now had this big infrastructure to make plastic. So it wasn't long after that that we started finding plastics in the average American household and really marketing plastics to people as a time-saving device. So in the beginning, again, plastic was this amazing material. It's cheap, it's durable, it's designed to last forever. And best of all, at the time, it was lauded as a boon to women's liberation. And this is verbatim from an article in Life magazine, 1955. These objects here, all these disposable objects, would take 40 hours to clean, except that no housewife need bother. We could just throw it all away. Our dishes, our plates, our cups. But no one was really thinking about away at the time. And all those same qualities of plastic that seem so wonderful, and really are wonderful, the fact that it's cheap and lightweight and durable, have some not so wonderful side effects. And I'm sure you've seen them right here in your local community. And if you've traveled around the world or not far, you can see the other side of this plastic. The fact that these materials are cheap, lightweight, and designed to last, and based from petrochemicals, fossil fuels. You needn't go as far as the Philippines, though, to see the impacts of our plastic waste. This is a shot I took on the Big Island of Hawaii just a few days before my first chance getting to sail across the North Pacific Gyre, otherwise known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And here on the Big Island of Hawaii, on a beach that very few people go to, this is not your typical surfer or tourist beach. It's called Camilo Beach, and it's also the southernmost point in the United States. And here is where, due to a unique configuration of currents, we have plastic trash from the gyres, from Asia, from North America, from Canada, from Mexico, converging on this one beach. And walking around this beach, I did see lettering, picking up bottles and shampoo containers in Chinese, Korean, Japanese, English, and Spanish. So this is washing up from the entire Pacific Rim. And it all starts right here in our backyards. People hear about the garbage patch and they assume that so much of it must come from cruise ships and from fishing fleets and from the maritime industry. But the vast majority, roughly 80%, depending on which ocean you're in, does start right here in our backyard. In my backyard, this is Marina del Rey up north from you guys, Bayona Creek. And this river, this creek, drains most of downtown Los Angeles. And you probably see the same thing in your local creeks, watersheds, and rivers, that after a big rain, all that disposable plastic, that floating plastic in our streets will wash into storm drains, into rivers, and out to sea. And it's once it gets out to sea where our work begins, because for most of us, it's the ultimate case of out of sight, out of mind. We don't really see it once it heads out into the oceans. And at that point, it gets swept up into these massive current systems that we call gyres. A gyre is just a spinning current system where floating plastic will gather, but not sinking plastic, because this is another interesting thing about plastics, is that roughly 50% will sink. So we have literally scratched the surface of this issue. We have no idea what's building up on the ocean floor. But to talk about the stuff that floats, I'm going to show you a current modeling study designed by NOAA to track drifters, to track drifting objects using satellites across the North Pacific Ocean. And as you watch this trajectory, you'll see roughly how the North Pacific Gyre moves. So this was a 20-year modeling study. And as you watch these objects, keep in mind that these are following those same currents that gather plastic waste. So after 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 10 years. So you can see a pattern. In roughly 6 to 10 years, imagine each of those drifters is a toothbrush or a lighter or a plastic bottle with a cap on. Because with the cap off, that kind of plastic, PET plastic, will sink. In 6 to 10 years, it's gone from California to Japan and back. And in 20 years, it's starting to pool in these two regions that we call the eastern and the western garbage patch. So the eastern garbage patch between California and Hawaii is the one that's gotten all the media play, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the island the size of Texas. The western garbage patch was one that we studied last summer for the first time and found out, sure enough, there's a garbage patch off the coast of Japan. And then connecting the two is an area we call the superhighway. So it's really the entire North Pacific Ocean, an area roughly 2 to 3 times the size of the continental United States, is a garbage patch. Now, it's not a patch in the sense of something very dense. We like to call it more of a plastic soup because it's very, very dispersed, very thinly diffused. But the point is that we're finding it across this entire region. And not just this one region. Judging by the name of our organization, 5 gyres. There are 5 large subtropical gyres in the world's oceans. We've been to all 5 in the last 3 years, and we have found plastic pollution across. That's the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the North Pacific, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. So how does this plastic, this petro-based plastic, affect marine ecosystems, affect some of the wildlife that live out there? So plastic, as you probably know, is not biodegradable, at least on a time scale that we humans can appreciate, but it is photodegradable. So UV light will make it brittle, wave action will churn it, break it up into small pieces, but as far as we know, those pieces stay out there indefinitely. Marine wildlife. So entanglement is a huge way that plastic affects animals, literally through entanglement, getting strangled or caught in it, and also through ingestion, which you learned about from Chris Jordan last week. This is a common snapping turtle that as a baby was caught in a small plastic ring, something harmless we might see in the street, that washed down the drain out to sea, and this is one of the results. We've now learned from one of our colleagues that today 100% of all sea turtle species are affected by plastic. In fact, he told us that every single necropsy he now does of turtles, he finds plastic. This is Dr. Jay Nichols. And ingestion. So this is actually a photo from Chris Jordan. You learned about this. This is on Midway Island. I've seen the same thing on Guadalupe Island. And it's not just the albatross, but it's today roughly half of all seabird species are affected by plastic. They either ingest it, mistaking it for food, or they get entangled in it. Another example of ingestion, this is a gray whale that washed up in Seattle, and they found 20 plastic bags in its stomach, along with other plastic packaging and film, an asthma inhaler. But it's not just marine wildlife. This is a photo showing terrestrial impacts of plastic. So this is a stomach stone. This is the stomach contents of a camel found in Dubai. And this 40-pound gastrolith, this stomach mass, was full of plastic bags and plastic netting. So really, it's not just animals in the ocean, but it's terrestrial animals, and its ecosystems worldwide are affected by our plastic waste. So my first chance actually seeing this firsthand was in 2008, joining the Algalita Marine Research Foundation with 5 other sailors to sail from Hawaii back to Los Angeles studying the North Pacific gyre. And the way we conduct our research is we drag this trawl, you can see on the bottom, that's our research equipment. We drag this trawl with a long net that has small holes, 1/3 of a millimeter, so we can gather plastic particles, small pieces of plastic, but then also examine zooplankton. And at the top there, you see a typical sample from the gyre, mostly these broken down fragments of plastic with one recognizable item. And we see this for thousands of miles. So we'll drop this trawl in the water, drag it on the surface of the ocean for an hour every 60 miles to do a transect across the entire ocean. Again, a typical sample, time after time after time. It's interesting, when you're out in the middle of a garbage patch, you don't see anything besides beautiful blue water as far as the eye can see, with the occasional fleck, a bottle cap, a lighter, a fragment of a crate or a bucket. But when we pull up our samples, this is what we see, this fine confetti of plastic. And I actually brought you, I'm going to try not to roam too far, but I brought here a sample. Maybe someone can grab it and pass it around the room. This is a sample from that research expedition in 2008. And what you see in this jar, this handful of plastic confetti, would have covered an area roughly 2 to 3 football fields in size. So that gives you an idea of just how diffuse it is, that it's not an island all contained in one area that you could stand on or plant a flag in. It's this thinly diffuse, dispersed plastic soup that covers, again, we estimate roughly 9 million soccer fields in the North Pacific alone. But this was what our samples looked like at night, and this led to a whole new investigation of this issue and how it affects the food chain. So at night is when many different creatures, zooplankton and other larger fish that feed on zooplankton, will surface from the depths to feed. We brought 660 of these fish, over 660 of these small fish called lanternfish, which are extremely abundant in the open ocean. They make up roughly 60% of the ocean's fish biomass. So these are fish that feed the bigger fish that you and I eat. These lanternfish are myctophids. We brought back, and this is what we found in roughly a third of their stomachs. You can see the plastic as well as the natural zooplankton that they should be eating. And when we looked at a drop of sample under a microscope, you can all see how easy it would be to make that mistake. This is one drop of a sample with 2 small pieces of plastic film. So I'll give your eyes a second to adjust and see if you can pick out those 2 pieces of film. Pretty hard to tell the difference. So again, the reason why this alarmed us is what we know about the way plastic behaves in the ocean. It's not just harmless pieces of plastic that go into the fish and out the other end. Plastic has a unique ability to absorb contaminants, pollutants that we call POPs, P-O-P-S. And you might have studied this already, persistent organic pollutants, things like PCBs or DDT, different hydrocarbons, oil drops that will drop drip by drip from our cars and wash out into the oceans. These chemicals don't mix with water, they're hydrophobic, but they will stick to plastic like a sponge at high concentrations. According to one researcher that we've worked with in Japan, Dr. Takada, he's shown that one single particle the size of a lentil can have up to 1 million times higher concentration of these pollutants than the water around it. So we know that animals are eating this animals are eating this plastic, including fish that you and I eat. Bigger fish eat those smaller fish. We're at the top of the food chain. So that brought up many questions for us. And this was another interesting study looking at plastic not just being ingested by animals, but actually entering the circulatory system of bivalves, of clams and mussels. So we're now seeing that this plastic is without a doubt entering the food chain. To what extent, we really don't know yet. This is fairly new science. But it does bring up the question of you and I, of our health, being at the top of the food chain. How common is this? Just how many fish out there are ingesting plastics? Do those pollutants from the plastic desorb into their bodies, get uptaken by their bodies, by their tissues, work their way up the food chain, and potentially enter our bodies? So I was curious about this as a woman thinking about one day having a child, which I've done, as you saw in the first slide. In 2009, we took a sample of my blood and sent it up to a lab that does special studies on body burdens. And by body burden, I mean the sum total of chemicals that all of us sitting in this room have stored in our bodies as a result of the lifestyles that we live, from our food, from our water, from our cosmetics, from our shampoos. So I'm going to show you what they found in my body. We were looking for PCBs, DDT, PFCs, and PBDEs, which are flame retardants. That's my sister.
So we just put about 60 ppc in my blood. We're now going to have it centrifuge to be sampled for PCBs, DDTs, and other chemicals. So we probably should one more round. Very much of your blood. Bringing one more round of my blood. Apparently, I need a lot.
That's my other sister. And we both had healthy, normal, beautiful babies. So the point of this is not that these chemicals that we all have in our body are going to make us necessarily sick today or tomorrow, but we now have a different understanding of some of these chemicals that are endocrine disruptors or hormone mimics. That it's not necessarily the amount of the chemical or the pollutant that has some sort of effect on us, but it's now the timing. It's now that we understand that the timing of the exposure can also be critical. That if, for example, a woman is pregnant and her developing child is going through critical stages, windows of development, could tiny, tiny amounts of those chemicals lead to reproductive disorders or issues with brain development? And again, the answer is that we don't really know for sure, nor do we really know how these chemicals interact with one another in the human body. But what I've seen, what I've read, and I would imagine you would share this concern, to me warrants action, that we don't need to wait till these chemicals are definitively proven to cause harm to humans, but that we should take proactive action. So these were all interesting happenings on this 2008 and then 2009 blood test that we did. But in 2008, something else happened that brought me to where I am today. On that same trip, studying the garbage patch, a little piece of which you're looking at in that jar coming around the room, but my now husband found a little floating piece of plastic netting and made a ring and proposed there in the middle of the garbage patch. And I said yes. But he said, first, there's something big that we have to do, because the world is not paying attention to this plastics issue. It's so new that he said, I want to build a boat and sail across the Pacific on a boat made out of plastic bottles. So we collected 15,000 plastic bottles. There he is, swimming in plastic. We collected a bunch of masts from broken down sailboats. We went to junkyards all over Los Angeles, and he's a good builder along with our other friend. They made a tic-tac-toe of these old masts. We took the bottles and we wrapped them in derelict fishing nets that we found on beaches from Washington all the way down to California. Put an airplane on top, a Cessna fuselage, and there's the boat. We called it Junk. The idea was for Marcus and our friend Joel, and I was the land support because I am not nearly the sailor for a voyage this risky. But the idea was that they would follow those same currents, launching right here from Long Beach, California, and ride the currents, no motor, just wind, to Hawaii through the garbage patch, and that this would bring attention to the issue of plastic pollution. It ended up taking not 6 weeks as we imagined, but it ended up taking 3 months, pretty much the entire summer. Marcus often says he could have walked faster to Hawaii. But on board, he was able to call me every day by satellite phone, including day 4 when they started sinking. And he called me and said, honey, we're sinking. Because 2,000 Nalgene bottles, which Patagonia discontinued because they have a chemical called BPA, they gave us all these bottles, said, have at it. They got loose. And fortunately, they were held onto the bottle by a thread, so we didn't pollute a bunch of tops out in the ocean. But the boat started sinking. And in the process of the boat sinking, all of the canned foods that we got donated from Whole Foods got wet, and all the labels came off. So the first video that you'll see describes that. It's kind of funny. They had beans, corn, and peas and had no idea which was which. But what you'll see later is probably the most alarming thing that we found, and what we have really been trying to bring awareness to, and that is how this plastic is entering the food chain.
The ocean stripped all the labels off our cans. They got rusted. Now we got to eat them. It's all beans and corn and peas.
Okay, come on, corn. Give me 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 corn. Corn. Beans.
One more?
Yeah.
Hey, let's see what it is.
We have the best. Let's go for the best before. More beans.
No wind. We're completely becalmed today. There's no wind whatsoever. So we're just going to fish and eat. Hey, fishy, 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 fishy. Oh, there he is. Right there. Ugh.
Lunch.
We are now skirting the edge of the North Pacific Gyre, roughly 1,000 miles east of Hawaii. And we're finding lots of plastic on the surface of the ocean.
It's mostly small fragments, blue, green, white, and black, among many different kinds of zooplankton. Everywhere you go in the North Pacific Ocean, we find plastic.
So I filleted this fish, thinking I'm going to eat it, and here's what I found. It's full of plastic. This is the whole reason that we're out here, to bring this to your attention. The plastic isn't benign. The fish won't pass it. The plastic is full of persistent organic pollutants, things like PCBs, DDT, PAHs, things that are known human carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, things you don't want in your body, but they're in the fish that we eat.
I don't want plastic in my sushi.
So that was a very long summer. But this is really why we did the mission, why we did this voyage, this project that seemed impossible and risky, was to bring attention to the science. They were running low on food. We didn't think that this voyage would take so long. And this was a fish that Marcus was on the verge of eating, put it in the fillet pan, decided to cut open the stomach, and 17 pieces of plastic poured out. And they didn't eat that one because of what I told you earlier about how we know that plastic in the oceans soaks up these pollutants that may be entering the bodies of these fish and up the food chain to you and I. And again, we don't know how prevalent this issue is. So my message here is not to stop eating fish, but just to bring attention to the fact that we can't continue to use our oceans as dumping grounds, because ultimately you and I depend on clean oceans and clean lands for our survival. So as we did this project Junk Raft, and as we sailed across the North Pacific with this other organization, we followed that up with a bike tour. The two of us cycled from Vancouver down to Mexico, giving away gyre samples and talking to legislators, and we got married along the way. And people kept asking, well, what about the other oceans? What about the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific? So with our wedding money, we decided, let's just do it ourselves. And I share this with you because you're all entering a world that sometimes there's a lot of fear about what jobs are there in my field, or what jobs are there, period. Sometimes you just have to do it yourself, and it takes a lot more creativity in this day and age to answer questions. But the good news is that the world is full of unanswered questions. Sometimes we think that it's all been done and discovered. In this case, there were unanswered questions about the Southern Hemisphere. No one had gone to the South Pacific, the Indian Ocean, or the South Atlantic exploring this issue of plastic pollution. So we started this organization, 5 Gyres, and set off and running on our honeymoon to cross the North Atlantic with 12 other people. So what we do with these expeditions, and the model we've created now, is to invite the public, to invite other scientists, other sailors. We've had artists, we've had pro surfers, we've had musicians, filmmakers, journalists, and students come on board these expeditions, help a bit with the fundraising to come on board, and then go back to their communities to share what they've learned. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what our research in the North Atlantic Gyre looked like. We found all kinds of interesting things in the Sargasso Sea, including another garbage patch. Let's bring it in.
Lots of marble fish, sargassum, and little plastic particles. Look at that. We're in the middle of the North Atlantic Gyre, also called the Sargasso Sea. It's called the Sargasso Sea because of sargassum. It's a kind of seaweed that filled our nest. But it's also full of small particles of plastic. What you got now?
I see one.
It's a mouthpiece, I think, for a boxer. It's got some barnacles, some sargassum. This is 45 minutes of scooping through another windrow in the middle of the Sargasso Sea.
Yeah.
It's going to fall out. So we just pulled out this plastic bucket, and we found a triggerfish inside. It's so big that it looks like it can't get out.
I think his entire life is in this jar. Here's the triggerfish. Look at these teeth. And look at this plastic bottle. And we find these all around the North Atlantic Gyre. Bits of plastics chewed on by marine life.
10 degrees, or climb about 100 meters. Dun-dun-dun.
No, Dorothy.
It was probably very, very clean. Might have been out there for 10, 20 years. So we also learned a very important lesson on this trip. This was the first expedition that we organized and found the crew, and we had just launched our nonprofit organization. And then we learned that you really shouldn't cross the North Atlantic Ocean in January. So here's our data set, and you can see a little gap in the research, and we now call that the hurricane gap. So we missed a pretty critical piece there, and in 2014, we're going to return to that area, and there'll be many spaces on board for any intrepid sailors in the room. Then we crossed the Indian Ocean, and this was a rare opportunity. The boat that we used, we don't own our own boat. It's very expensive, but we charter other boats. We bring customers on board. We bring other scientists on board, and that way we avoid the expense of owning a boat. The boat that we were on didn't look like it was going to be anywhere near the Indian Ocean. This was one that we didn't know how we would get to, and then we got a phone call from some people in Amsterdam who owned a boat, a very beautiful boat, and they said, "Can we fly you out to Perth, and will you sail with us to Mauritius on this vessel?" And we thought about it for about 2 seconds, and we said, sure. It wasn't exactly the best research boat in the world, but it still was an amazing experience. You could climb all the way up to the mast. I'd like to look for plastic perched all the way on the end of the boat there, the front. But this is what we found. Again, sample after sample, as we approached the center of that accumulation zone, looked like this. Broken down pieces of plastic, the occasional recognizable object mixed in with marine life, with fish, with zooplankton. And then we did the South Atlantic. We actually did 3 transects through the South Atlantic, so we got a really robust data set from this area. And I'm going to show you one final video that really gives an idea of what it's like to be at sea. I need my tech genius to bring up the video. But this was also a pretty brutal crossing for about 2 weeks, and then it was beautiful. We had, again, a collection of interesting people. And this gives you the sense for what it's like to be out in the middle of nowhere and be finding plastic.
This is not just another sailing voyage across an ocean. 13 people from different walks of life, with different expectations, all aboard a research vessel for 30 days. Sailing to a place rarely observed by the human eye. We are heading into the unknown.
Realistically, what I'm looking at, we're going to end up going southeast, further south of the course that we want to because of the conditions. We've got this big high pressure. It's a lot further south than it ever normally would be, but that's what it is.
I've never been at sea for this long of a period.
I think I'm ready for living at sea.
We're heading that way east for about 3,300 miles.
We've got 28 days, 29 days to do that. We plan to be there early December. And we'll go straight through the middle of the South Atlantic Gyre, looking at the plastics there in the ocean. We're going to get some fresh food and local produce, and we'll get some fuel on board as well. Planning on spending just over 4 weeks at sea, transecting through the middle of the South Atlantic, through the Gyre.
It's our goal on these expeditions to empower people with education and an authentic vantage from Gyre Central.
Now, no one's been out to this part of the world to investigate this particular problem of plastic marine pollution floating on the ocean surface. This is the first time.
There's incredible amounts of plastic out here, thousands of miles from land, which is actually polluting this beautiful wilderness.
Seeing that I mistake marine life for plastics made me realize how simple it must be for marine life to mistake plastics for food.
Pollutants and plastics may be bioaccumulating with the food chain. Well, the apex predator of that food chain is ultimately humans.
It's pretty sad to see how many small pieces of plastic are out in the ocean affecting not only marine life, but possibly humans as well.
And when you think about plastic everywhere, it's a pretty startling issue. It's a pretty difficult thing on the senses to get your head around.
This is the fourth of 5 large subtropical gyres in the world. And like the others, this one is full of marine plastic pollution.
And for me, it's always about looking forward, looking towards the next wind shift, the next weather system, competing against the other boats. But for the first time in this project, I've been forced to actually look down into the ocean and see what's there. And it's just been a revelation. It's just opened my eyes to the fact that there is a huge amount of plastic here in the ocean. We discovered that for the first time for me in the North Atlantic earlier this year, and now again here in the South Atlantic. Daily we're sailing past pieces of plastic, plastic water bottles, plastic film, plastic fishing line, plastic packaging, plastic crates, and photodegraded particulate pieces of plastic as well. So it's been a real eye-opener.
We've been traveling day and night every 60 miles across the South Atlantic Ocean, and every single sample has contained plastic pollution.
1, 2, 3.
We've been finding small, broken down pieces of plastic, like pieces of water bottles or toothbrushes, lighters. It's like a plastic confetti across the entire surface of the ocean.
When we use our nets to skim the surface, you get that little handful of confetti in every trawl. And it's really every trawl. We left Rio de Janeiro 2 weeks ago, began trawling within a couple hundred miles. First trawl, plastic. Next trawl, plastic. Every one. The trawls now easily have 5 times more plastic than the first ones. We're in the middle of the gyre, and we're finding exactly what we expected.
What we have seen amid the cresting waves is no figment of the imagination, no refraction of light on water. With eyes open to this reality, we are left to save our synthetic seas.
So then there was one final gyre in our global survey, and that's the South Pacific. This one was very interesting, looking at all the other models for where the predicted accumulation zone would be. This one looked like the biggest, between Valdivia, Chile, Easter Island, and then on to Tahiti. So we didn't know, would we find more plastic here or less, because the countries that you have kind of bordering this region might not be feeding as much plastic in. So what we did find is the only 2 samples in all of our surveys that came up clean. Those were right off the coast of Chile. But then as we got into the predicted accumulation zone, we saw a spike, like a perfect bell curve. Going into the gyre, plastic, and then leaving the gyre, again, no plastic. So this was very interesting. This is actually our first publication. It came out just a few months ago. And now we're working on synthesizing the rest of our data so we can really share this with the public. And this was our intrepid crew, again, a motley crew. We even had a bag monster up in the right-hand corner there. In fact, the man wearing that bag monster outfit is the founder and CEO of a company called Chico Bag, which I'm guessing some of you might have. It's the little bag that fits in the stuff sack. And he was actually being sued at the time for the plastics industry. That's a whole other long story, but came out on board to see this with his own eyes and bring this back to his company and be able to speak with that much more authenticity about what's actually out in those oceans. So let's talk about some solutions, and then I want to open it up to any questions or any comments from any of you. So the 3 main solutions, there are many solutions, no one single solution, but the 3 main categories that I see are design, that this is essentially a design flaw, policy, that we need legislative action to correct some of these problems or at least slow them, and then finally individual action, which is the low-hanging fruit, but also very important. So to start with some design and innovation, one, just improving our efficiency with recycling. The way we recycle our plastics now, there are 7 different kinds of plastic, 1 through 7. When you look on the bottom of any plastic item, whether it's a bottle or a yogurt container, you see that little symbol, the little chasing arrow symbol with a number. And to most people, that would imply that that product is recyclable. It actually has no bearing at all on the recyclability of that product. That just tells you, is it number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And every municipality has different laws. And most of our plastic that we put on our curbside here in this country, a lot of it actually gets shipped overseas. So it'd be an interesting thing for you to look at, where does your recycling actually go, and how much of it is truly being recycled or downcycled? Because with most plastic, we're not taking a bottle and turning it into a bottle. We're downcycling it into carpeting or fake clothing or fake lumber, that Trex lumber, which may then just be one step away from the landfill. So maybe we're just giving it one final life before it goes on to the landfill. But plastic is a very valuable material. It's fossil fuel based. We need to improve both our ability to recycle it and to recover it. If we could improve our recoverability, then we wouldn't be seeing plastic litter covering our streets and ultimately oceans. Waste to energy is another strategy that's used in a lot of countries. Some countries just outright burn plastic, incinerate it, which is not a good idea. It releases all kinds of chemicals and is really bad for our air quality. Another thing is to high heat, either gasify or incinerate plastic to recapture it for energy, which is also being done. And then on the design front, it really doesn't make sense to take this valuable material and make things like bottles and bags and things that are designed to be thrown away. Could we use plant-based materials, things that will truly biodegrade or truly break down in your compost pile? Now, we're not necessarily quite there yet. In my opinion, a lot of the bioplastics are unfortunately some greenwashing. In fact, my husband's doing an experiment in our backyard because with a baby, the big thing is, what are you going to do about diapers? So we're doing cloth and some other things at home, but for most people, they're not ready to go that far. So there are all these compostable, biodegradable, degradable items on the market. Are they really breaking down? They won't break down in your backyard composter. Most of them need to go to a municipal composting facility. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about bioplastics, but we certainly have the intelligence to do this. And there is one kind of bioplastic out there that has been shown to be marine degradable. Most of the corn-based plastics that you see on the market are not marine degradable. That's PLA plastic. But there's another kind, PHA plastic, which may be very promising. It's not widely used yet. So, with design, with intelligence, with innovation, we can certainly fix this problem. But again, we have a long way to go. Legislation. So this is also a critical road to go. It's unfortunately a very slow road. It can often take a city or a country many years to pass pieces of legislation, whereas companies can often move very quickly if they want to make a change. But two examples of this are EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, and this is where the producers actually take responsibility for the end life of their product instead of putting the burden on all of us. And then straight out bans and fees, which is happening around the world, things like bans on plastic bags or fees on plastic bags to really get people to start doing the right thing. So what can we all do? Then there's also individual action, the role of every one of us consumers, or I prefer to say citizens, but just not using individual disposable throwaway plastics, making small, simple changes in our lifestyles to use reusables or not take a straw when you go out to eat in your drink, bringing your own bag to the market, those small things that we can all do that add up. But the role of the individual, these tiny little actions, are much more powerful when they're widespread, when there's a ripple effect. And I'm going to show you one example of this that I really love. This is a school, a middle school that we've worked with up in Silver Lake. They were really inspired by this plastics issue and noticed that they were using styrofoam trays in their lunches and throwing them away every single day. So after giving a few talks there, these students band together and they made a tree. They collected all the styrofoam trays that they use in their cafeteria for a week, and they strung them up in the middle of campus and made this tray tree. And that certainly got the attention of the administration, and they figured that by spending 3 cents per tray multiplied by the school days in the year and all of the students, they were spending $12,000 a year on disposable trays alone. So this is another great example of how sometimes making the right sustainable choice can also be the right economic choice. They banned styrofoam trays at their school, and this caught the attention of the district. And the entire district of Los Angeles, the largest school district in the country, has now banned styrofoam trays. So again, this is a great example of how small actions have a ripple effect and can really amount to something substantial. And then, of course, the tools that we now have at our disposal, one of which is social media, that every single one of us is carrying around a little handheld computer and a little communication tool that allows us to create these ripple effects from these small individual actions. This is another example. I'm sure most of you, or a lot of you, get daily or weekly emails about sign this petition and sign that petition, and I get those all, and I was starting to lose faith. But our communications director, who's very hip to social media, started a petition because he had heard that the parks director of national parks was getting pressure from Coca-Cola to not ban plastic bottles. There was an initiative to start banning plastic bottles in parks because they're a huge percentage of their waste. But because Coca-Cola has a lot of stake, they have all these vending machines and are selling water, they put some pressure and threw a bunch of money at it, and the park director said, okay, we won't do it. So we launched a petition on change.org, and within 2 weeks there were 100,000 signatures, and the parks director overturned his decision. So this kind of re-inspired me of the power of social media, of the power that every single one of us has to influence and sometimes pressure companies to do the right thing. And then the role of science. We need good science to provide us with the information to drive some of these campaigns. And this is another very interesting example that floored us. We've done all this research on oceans, but last summer we did our first investigation of the Great Lakes. And what we found in one single sample was more plastic particles by count than any single sample we've collected anywhere in the world's oceans. And in this one sample, it was full of these tiny little plastic beads, these perfectly round spherical microbeads. And under a very powerful microscope, looking at these beads and looking at some other products, we think that we know what they are. And I'll let you think about it for 1 second. Anyone use these? probably a lot of women are surprised, and I was shocked when I saw this, that a lot of these products that we use as exfoliants to scrub our face actually contain plastic. Now you can see on the right, those are products that use biodegradable cocoa shells, cocoa beans, or apricot kernels. But now if you look on the back of the ingredient list of some of these products, it's listed right there. Microbeads, polyethylene. So this is an example where it's the worst example of bad design. These are products that are designed to go from our face down the drain and out into our local watersheds. So this is now the basis of a campaign for 2013 to get companies to eliminate these products. It's already been done in Europe. Unilever, a huge company, committed to phase them out by 2015. We just got word yesterday that the Body Shop will do the same, and now we're working on some bigger parent companies. So I encourage all of you that are also using Instagram and Twitter and Facebook to find us on some sort of social media channel and follow this, because we're going to be needing all of your help to launch this campaign. And then finally, the point of all of this is that armed with good information, with good science, with good data, that we have the power to drive policy. We're seeing this in city after city after city, things like the plastic bag bans that we're seeing. Or I don't know if you've read any of the examples this year. There was a young girl, 15-year-old, who was able to get Gatorade to commit to not putting basically flame retardant products in their Gatorade, and this was also through an online petition. So we have a tremendous amount of power. I know that you all in this room are interested in sustainability, and I hope that you'll continue to educate yourself. If anything that you saw here struck your interest and you want to get more involved with us, we do have expeditions coming up. We really encourage citizen science. So on every expedition, we invite people to come on board, or if people happen to be crossing an ocean, or if you just happen to have a boat in your backyard, we also have simple research equipment that we provide to sailors around the world so that they can collect their own data and contribute to that global data set. So with that, I am going to open it up to any questions or comments. And again, thank you so much for inviting me here to share this with you. And I hope you'll find us on social media, and I hope we can stay in touch. So thank you. I actually don't know how much time you have, but if there's a question or two, or... Okay. Yes. You should see our backyard. Most of the plastic is like what you saw in that sample jar coming around. We save all of our samples and we bring these to the lab where they actually count every single piece of plastic. The bigger items, like we had an expedition last summer crossing the tsunami debris field. I mean, literally, we do have a lot of this stuff collecting in our backyard. My husband, in addition to being an engineer and inventor, is also an artist. So he made a traveling exhibit with a lot of this stuff that just premiered at the Long Beach Aquarium and is now, we're trying to get it touring around the country. And that has a piece of tsunami debris. It has a full-size sculpture of my body at 5 months pregnant using plastic that we collected in all 5 gyres to show the idea of plastics, the human body, contaminants, next generation. So yeah, we collect a lot of it and we display it to show people. Yes?
Have you gone back and done, I guess, studies again? Have you seen progress after your results and stuff like that?
That's a great question. So we incorporated at the very end of 2009, and at the tail end of 2011, we finished our first global survey. So that's a great question because we're trying to establish some baseline information. Now that we've done all 5 gyres, we will begin our return so we can track any change over time. We have so little information, though, that it's really, really difficult yet to really establish any trends. I would say of the 5 subtropical gyres, the 2 that have been the best studied are the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic has a huge data set. And one interesting thing is they're finding that the small stuff, that there's not really a tremendous increase, which brings up many questions about where is that small stuff going? Is it sequestering in the ocean floor? Is it being ingested by organisms? So again, we will need much more data to start establishing those trends. Our next expedition is coming up in the end of May. And because I've decided not to take my little one on board, there is one spot. If anyone is interested in crossing the Bay of Bengal, you can talk to me. That will be from Sri Lanka to Singapore testing out a piece of equipment that is going to look at the vertical distribution. So we always look at the surface. This is a vertical slice of that ocean to see what's in the water column. Any other questions?
There's one up there.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
So this is obviously a problem. Why is that only non-profit organizations take care of this and not politicians?
Well, I would say a few things. Great question. Why are only nonprofits looking at this and not governments? Governments are beginning to get wind of this issue. The first research on this issue, the first published research on the North Pacific was only in 1999. So in the big picture, it's relatively new. This is now attracting the attention of UNEP. I know the United Nations has been looking at this. NOAA has been looking at this. And the more information, the more science, good science that we have, the more now it is driving policy. So even something as simple as the bag bans that are happening around the country and around the world are being informed by science, scientists and advocates putting pressure on legislators to actually do something about this. The next big step is to get the United States to look at some of the EPR legislation that is more common in Europe, and I'm sure you could speak to that much better having lived there. Did I answer your question? I think there's a lot of work to be done. I would like to see more responsibility coming from government, but sometimes the industry has a lot of power. I mean, we're talking about the petroleum industry, and there's a tremendous amount of money in fighting our research. So the more we can get this stuff published and in the hands of politicians, the more we're going to see change. There and here. Another great question, like where is all this stuff coming from? So yes, it is litter, it's ordinary people, it's garbage cans overflowing with waste, it's the maritime industry. You know, I said that most of it comes from land, but some of it absolutely comes from sea. Even though we have laws right now, we have international laws that prevent dumping, and particularly plastic at sea. It still happens. I've had, after a few presentations, I've had people from the Navy come up and say, gosh, we still are dumping our stuff overboard. It's very difficult to enforce what happens in international waters. But ultimately, the problem is that product, that plastic waste, that broken toy, that broken piece of equipment has no inherent value. And so it winds up being littered. It winds up falling out of recycling containers. It winds up as accidental and intentional litter. And it's that trickle, piece by piece by piece, that's entering our oceans that amounts to the biggest petroleum spill in the world on a daily basis.
So if people recycle more, then is it one of the ways to prevent this?
Well, recovery will certainly help this issue. If we're truly recycling and recovering our products, but our recycling rates for plastic are abysmal in this country. It's between 5 and 10%, depending on what items that you're looking at, and a little bit higher for containers because they do have a deposit. We need to get that number up to, if that number was 100%, sure, we wouldn't have an issue. There was a question over here.
I was wondering if you could speak briefly about your choice and your experience doing research through a nonprofit organization. So I also sort of straddle the roles of research and activism a little bit. And it's very inspiring to see that you've been successful. And I would just like to hear you talk about.
That's another great question. Yeah, my background is not science. My background is policy. So I studied for my master's a little bit of science, a little bit of policy, a little bit of education. My husband's the one with the PhD who designs our research and designs our research protocols and our models and publishes the paper. We have definitely gotten criticism for being activists, and activism is not always looked upon favorably in the scientific community. We are looked upon as a little bit scrappy. We're this startup organization of a small group of people tackling this huge issue, and there are much bigger institutions that sometimes look at us as, well, because you're doing this activism, you're not really doing true and pure science. But we feel, and I know my husband feels very strongly about this, that in this day and age, seeing what we've seen, it's almost an obligation as a researcher. Once you're finding this science that is showing these detrimental effects, that it's an obligation to share this. And if that looks like advocacy to people, we're willing to take that criticism. We had our first peer-reviewed published paper about 4 months ago, and that changes the tone of things, because until you're published, again, you're just an activist. Now we're straddling that line of research and advocacy, but have more credibility now that we have publications under our belt. Did that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, unless there's
Please, I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
You could speak a little bit about the question of funding and about alternative funding models. Right? So sometimes I have the choice of, should I go and raise money for this activist project in the nonprofit way, or should I write an NSF grant?
Mm-hmm. Can I have your card? Yeah, so we're a nonprofit organization. In the first year of operations, we got going so quickly. We incorporated at the end of December, and we were off and running in January doing our first expedition. So we didn't even have time to look into foundation grants. Our first year or two of funding was almost entirely from the corporate world and some individuals. And by the corporate world, I mean the outdoor brands, the Patagonias and the Tevas and the Ospreys and Clean Canteen here. Those were some of our big supporters, with one surprising large grant from Electrolux, a vacuum cleaner company that was based in Sweden, and they were trying to raise awareness through designing a vacuum cleaner full of plastic to show people from the gyres. We're now that we're a few years in, trying to diversify, and that's my least favorite part of this work. I would counsel people to think very, very carefully before they engage in starting a nonprofit, because it is a hard road. But if you're passionate about it, I still think it's a great thing to do. It's what I'm now spending the majority of my time doing, in between raising a child and doing some of the expeditions, is looking for funding. What was the original part of the question?
So one last question then. Do you think that NSF would fund research on marine plastics? I feel like they...
Yes,
right?
I do. And I think especially now that we're published, we would be a lot more attractive for an NSF grant. So I would love to chat with you more.
Partnership with the university.
What's that?
You can just make a partnership with UC.
Oh, well, isn't that a good idea? Okay.
I can drive for research funding. But there was another
Fantastic.
question up there as well. Yes.
Do you know what's being done about the current plastic?
That's another great question. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It went viral about a young guy, 19-year-old, who designed a technological contraption for going out and eating plastic. I see a couple heads nodding. My funding issues would be over if I had a nickel for every single time someone called us and said they have an idea for going out to the gyre and mining the gyre and collecting it and making fuel and recycling it. Having been across all these oceans and seeing just the vastness of our oceans, which you really don't get a sense for until you cross an ocean, and how spread out the plastic is, there's really not much we can do, and I hate to be negative, but not much we can do about the plastic that's already out there. The good news, though, is that gyres do have a tendency to spit plastic back out. The North Pacific gyre will butt up against the coast every 3 to 5 years in a cycle, so that stuff eventually spits back out onto islands and onto the coastline. So when we do beach cleanups, even though that's a Band-Aid, that is gyre cleanup in a sense. The best thing that we can do, unless there's some miracle invention that comes along, is prevention.
But is there no more research going on about what to do with plastic, trying to do something else?
Oh, there's all kinds of research going on what to do with it. There's been some people with a concept for turning it back into fuel. To do this at sea, I don't think is feasible. You would burn more petroleum going out to the gyre than you would collecting it. You saw those small pieces that were spread out over massive areas. So collection without removing tons of life. In that same jar, you saw it was full of krill and plankton and fish. So to skim the ocean surface without removing tremendous amounts of biomass, no one's really figured out how to do that. But yes, there's research going on all the time about can we recycle this method. You probably have heard about that method. The cleaning product is looking at using not ocean plastics, but plastic that wash back up to shore to fashion their bottles. So that's another form of recycling or upcycling, I suppose. Maybe one more. I mean, I can take as many as you want, but you probably have other stuff to do. One more question?
Sure.
Or, yeah.
Can you take
2
or 3 more?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take these last 3
My
questions.
husband's babysitting, so I'm
All right, let's take these
good.
These last 3 questions. 1, 2, and 3.
Off the question they don't
Absolutely,
have to consider how they make their products, or consumers being more conscious of what they're buying or buying less. I know
Absolutely.
That's something big right now. A lot of people in Northern California are arguing against waste to energy, and I don't know, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, similar to with bioplastics, I think there are certain applications, and if you're going to introduce something like that, it has to come along with education. It has to come along with education to show people this is a last resort. Just because we are, recapturing some of the energy through pyrolysis or, different waste to energy methods, that doesn't give us license to keep polluting. The same with bioplastics. There was a concern that if people know that this is biodegradable, they'll say, "Oh, great, I can just chuck it wherever." So these things can have, unintended consequences, and it's very important to think through all the ramifications of a new technology before introducing it. But if it can truly be done, maybe in the future we'll be mining our landfills. I mean, our landfills are full of incredibly valuable materials. Could there be a way of recapturing some of that energy and some of those resources? So I completely agree with your point. I think it has to be done carefully, and I think we have to look case by case. Is this the right application, or could we be doing something better? Sure. Yes?
About the Grand Canyon plastic bottle ban, how did that petition become successful? Are there a lot of petitions?
There are a lot of petitions. Our communications director is really good with social media tools, and there's definitely a community of plastic pollution organizations that all kind of got on board and helped it to have a short little, I wouldn't say super viral, but enough to get 100,000 signatures, and that was enough to put the pressure back on. But yeah, we can get kind of cyber activism overload. I mean, I definitely get 2, 3, 4 of those a day. So to really make one stand out, I think collaboration is really critical to get other groups that are like-minded and to have a good story. What made this one really successful is that it was written as a personal narrative. Having been to the gyres and seen what I've seen, I'm asking you, I'm imploring the public. And I think that's also why this 15-year-old who did a Change.org petition with Gatorade was so successful, that there was something very personal about it. So good storytelling is critical. Maybe one more question?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't you think recycling should be a law, and people who make the law should be given a penalty? I think that's like the only way for this, the littering in the ocean stops.
Well, it's tough to enforce that. I think there are many different ways you can penalize bad behavior, you can incentivize good behavior. I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, because I think it's also cultural. It depends on what country you're in. Are you talking on a global level, or are you talking just in the United States? Some countries don't yet have a really good infrastructure for dealing with waste. We have a pretty developed infrastructure in this country for at least just recapturing and redistributing some of our waste. So, but should it be enforceable by death penalty? I'm not sure. Well, that was a little extreme.
That'd be extreme.
Yes.
Well, good.
Yeah, and I'll leave my contact information. I'm pretty easy to find, just Anna at 5 Gyres. Again, we're on Facebook and Instagram and all those places. Would love to keep in touch. And seriously, if anyone is interested in getting involved, we welcome interns, we welcome people to come on board, and we hope some of you are touched by this issue.
And let me say 2 things. One is that a couple of classes ago, I forget which year it was, we had the director, the founder of 2041, an organization that sails around the world, informing people about Antarctica and trying to have the treaty that ends in 2041 made a permanent treaty. And he said to the class, if anybody wants to come, and one person in the class called him up and ended up in Antarctica that year and changed his life. It was a fantastic experience. Secondly, organizations like this that are doing research need support, and any one of you has the capacity to help 5 Gyres. I really think this is a wonderful organization that's doing incredibly important work on something that's has the potential to affect all of our lives. So please join me in thanking Anna for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.